Greetings. My name is Tony Fauci, and it is my great pleasure to address the 2020 International Pediatric HIV Workshop. I would like to thank my friend Lynn Matheson for the kind invitation and for the opportunity to speak to you today about COVID-19 and COVID-19 vaccines. I also thank you for all your good work, especially during these difficult times. I'm going to talk about COVID-19 vaccines with a specific view from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. So I'm dividing it up into 5 separate buckets in which we will take a few slides each to talk about each of these elements. First, the U.S. government vaccine development stakeholders. And here they are, a number of agencies that we have now been working together in a very cooperative and collaborative way. We have the NIH, particularly but not exclusively NIAID, involved in basic and clinical research, together closely with the Department of Defense and Operation Warp Speed, providing both basic and clinical research as well as manufacturing and advanced development specifically for their warfighters. We have ASPR, the Assistant Secretary for Prevention and Response, and BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, who do advanced clinical development and oversee the Strategic National Stockpile. Of course, the ever important FDA as the regulatory individual agency that is involved at every stage of vaccine development. We have the CDC, who have been our partners in all of these outbreaks. Via Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices will recommend who is vaccinated and what and when that vaccination occurs. The pre-COVID U.S. government vaccine development model maintains itself today, where you have the early concept and product development of the NIH and, as I mentioned, the DoD. BARDA then takes over with advanced development, partnering with industry and commercial manufacturing, and the regulatory review by the FDA. But please note that for the standpoint of COVID-19, industry and the FDA are involved at virtually every step of the process, which has really made it really quite smooth as we've gone on to the development of COVID-19 vaccines. The second is basic research, which I've divided into 2 buckets. First, the new platforms. This has been very important because we have taken a chance in going forth with certain platforms that have not been as proven as some of the more classic, such as the mRNA and DNA vaccines. We also have viral vectors that are being widely used now, adenovirus, VSV, recombinant proteins, the classical way of vaccine development, but also nanoparticles, virus-like particles, and again, adjuvants, particularly when involved with the recombinant proteins. And then there's this issue that's very important and has really seen its early development during the HIV vaccine issues, where structure-based vaccine design has become extremely important. We have now adapted this very well, predominantly, but not exclusively, by work from the Vaccine Research Center led by Barney Graham and John Mascola. As shown on this Nature paper, the vaccine design enabled by prototype pathogen preparedness, where we look at all of our experience with coronaviruses and the atomic level structure of the very important spike protein shown with the receptor binding domain in green, as a matter of fact, is the fundamental common denominator of virtually all of the vaccines that are being used and tested right now for COVID-19. And then there's clinical research and the extensive experience that we have in clinical research. Again, I want to divide this into 3 subgroups. First, the clinical trial networks that we have spent decades and decades in building up from the early years of HIV in the early 1980s, with the AIDS treatment evaluation units, which ultimately became the ACTG, or AIDS Treatment Evaluation Group. And this is a group that now, even today, is playing an important role in all our clinical trials. And as the years went by, different networks were established, including the HIV Prevention Trials Network and the HIV Vaccine Trials Network, both of which are currently, as I speak to you today, playing an important role in the clinical trials of multiple COVID-19 vaccine candidates. Then there's this entire concept of doing clinical research within the setting of an outbreak, something that's very important that we learned and proved when we did phase 2 H1N1 vaccine trials during a pandemic outbreak, when we did research in Ebola in both West Africa and the DRC in the middle of an outbreak. And then we did Zika trials during an outbreak of Zika in South and Central America. And now currently with Operation Warp Speed, we're doing vaccine trials and therapy trials in the middle of a historic outbreak. In fact, this approach of being able to do clinical research in the middle of an ongoing outbreak has been endorsed very strongly by a report from the National Academy of Sciences in April of 2017, in which they clearly and said core principles of science and ethics in conducting clinical research do not change during an epidemic. And randomized controlled trials are ethical and appropriate in this setting. They are the most efficient and reliable way to determine safety and efficacy. And in fact, the recent trials that are ongoing right now have clearly proven this to be the case. And finally, community engagement. Let me hearken back to my own personal experiences with community during the early years of the HIV outbreak. I show this as history. This is 1988, in the beginning when the federal government was felt, and I think correctly, to not being as attentive to the needs of the community involved, namely at that time, mostly men who have sex with men in the United States. And Larry Kramer, who was a nemesis of mine in the beginning, who became one of my close and dear friends, wrote this in the San Francisco Examiner right now, 32 years ago. He said, "I call you murderers," an open letter to an incompetent idiot, Dr. Anthony Fauci of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. That's what I call a real attention getter. Here they were storming the NIH, essentially saying, you're not listening to what we have to do in the input for our needs in a clinical trial and the research agenda. And again, they were very, very clear in what they were saying. They got our attention and it all worked out well, because one of the best things I ever did was to engage deeply and closely with the community, which ultimately led to a very, very positive effect in the HIV research effort. And in fact, this is something that if you all have the chance to do it, it's a documentary available, I'm sure, on a variety of YouTube and Netflix and others, How to Survive a Plague, which was a film by David France about the community activism during that time. What all that led to were community programs that were deeply integrated into everything we did out of the HIV/AIDS effort. And this is the kind of thing that is now being used as a model as we go forth with the Community Engagement Alliance, or SEAL team, which is a multi-institute pan-NIH entity which leverages the long-standing clinical trial network and community engagement, as well as the Covet Community Engagement Working Group, building on our HIV trial expertise. Moving on to the COVID-19 clinical trial approach. We have been taking what I call a strategic approach to COVID-19 vaccines, as articulated in this discussion in Science from May of 2020, in which my colleagues and I put forth what we call a strategic approach, which is really a harmonized protocol in which the 6 companies which the US government is engaged in through Operation Warp Speed to have a common data and safety monitoring board, except for just one of the groups, but 5 out of 6 did, to have common primary and secondary endpoints and common immunological parameters that would allow bridging from one study to another should one get to the finish line before others. These are the companies and the platforms involved: nucleic acid, particularly messenger RNA, with Pfizer and Moderna, viral vectors, adenovirus, both human and chimp, and VSV, with AstraZeneca, Janssen, and Merck, and the classical protein subunits with adjuvants with Novavax and Sanofi. As you can see, 5 of these are in phase 3 trial. 2 of them are fully enrolled and, in fact, started on June 27th, one of which has had a very striking result. The guide for industry, it's important for the developers of the vaccine to plan for pediatric assessments of safety and effectiveness given the nature of the COVID-19 public health emergency. The epidemiology and pathogenesis and the safety and effectiveness of vaccines may be different in children compared to adults. So obviously thinking the importance of ultimately getting efficacy results, but also attention to the safety and the vulnerability of children. As I mentioned a moment ago, kids will need a vaccine, and Pfizer, which is the company that has gotten the first of a highly effective vaccine, they plan to expand their trial to ages 12 and up. And ultimately, by bridging studies, we will get safety and immunogenicity data in children that would allow us to bridge to the efficacy studies. Now, one of the most important things that's happened in this whole effort is that Pfizer has announced on Monday, November the 9th, that they have now a highly successful vaccine with a greater than 90% efficacy against symptomatic COVID-19 in their interim analysis. This is extraordinarily good news for the vaccine program for so many reasons. One, this candidate itself, but also other candidates that I mentioned on a prior slide, like Moderna, have very similar, if not identical, platform with the mRNA and the spike protein that is used in virtually all of the vaccine candidates has now been shown to be a very, very important target of the immune response that, when used as an immunogen, induces a protective response. So again, this is all very good news. And then finally, what about vaccine distribution? This is something that is the ultimate responsibility of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, with advice from their Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, which input from the National Academy of Sciences. And this group, the National Academy, which was been called upon by the NIH and the CDC to supplement the consulting to and the advice for the CDC. They recently released their framework for distributing. The ultimate decision, again, is with the CDC. But as you can see, the various phases here: high-risk healthcare workers and first responders, followed by high-risk people with comorbid conditions, older adults in congregate crowded residences such as nursing homes and extended care facilities. Then next, teachers and school staff and childcare workers, people who do essential work in the community to keep the trains running and the electricity going, moderate risk, comorbid, homeless shelters, group homes, jails, prisons, and then finally, younger adults, children, peoples who have work of high importance, but not in phase 1 or 2, and then phase 4, all others. An important thing we must do is get people, now that we know we have a highly effective vaccine, to get those people vaccinated. This study shown from Science this past June shows the extraordinarily disturbing number of people, or percentage, who have skepticism about vaccines, either don't want it or not sure about it. And note particularly in the minority communities that this is an issue. We need to overcome this by the community outreach that I mentioned just a moment ago. I believe that a vaccine with a more than 90% efficacy is going to go a long way to convincing people, of even people shown on this slide represented with the different colors, may change their mind about their skepticism about getting vaccinated. Now, again, when you look at vaccines, you got to put it in the context of a number of other preventive modalities that we know work: masks, physical distancing, avoiding crowds, doing things outdoors more than indoors, washing hands frequently. All of the things that are shown on this slide must keep going. Even if you had a vaccine that was moderately effective, you're still going to do some of this. And now that we recently know we have a vaccine that's highly effective, you still cannot completely eliminate those other public health measures until we get the entire community, both domestic and globally, who are protected by virtue of their immune response against this virus, thereby ending COVID-19 as a pandemic. Once we do that, we can begin to rapidly approach some degree of normality, which everyone on this earth, really, not only in this country, is longing for. And finally, as shown on this last slide, we have been through now 3 coronavirus pandemics. Clearly, what we need is shown on this slide. We need a universal coronavirus vaccine, the same way we need a universal influenza vaccine. And as my colleagues mentioned on this publication from May of this year, the time to start is now, because we must be prepared for the fact that this will occur again. It may not be coronavirus, but it will be something else. We must be prepared for the future and let the lessons learned, which have been very painful, be lessons that we can take with us as we go forward. Again, thank you for giving me the opportunity to make this presentation.